Hello everyone and welcome to Pyanodons Mods. This is Otaku Showboat, and in this tutorial we will be going over the copper ore processing chain, as well as my thoughts on obtaining the outside resources required in the more advanced sections of the chain. As a general disclaimer, Pyanodons mods are in a constant state of flux, and I will not be focusing as much on the numbers in each individual step along the line. I will talk about some numbers, but just know that all numbers are subject to change at any time. So chances are maybe by the time you see this video, if it's several months down the line, things may be different, so just bear that in mind. This tutorial is also based off of the current full Pyanodon suite of 6 total mods. This is before the release of Pi Alien Life. I am also using the Infinity mod in order to help showcase the full chain. Also, I need to note that I am using the Realistic Ores mod for this particular playthrough. Therefore, you may notice that copper looks closer to iron and iron looks closer to copper. This is intended because this is more realistic. Exposed copper would appear bluish green, or greenish blue, or however you want to call it. I have a full list of mods that are being used for this particular video on my website under my streaming schedule page. The mods are the same mods as for the first Factorio Pyanodons streaming series, besides the Infinity mod, which I have thus mentioned I am using for the showcase here. So here, as you can see, is the overview. Here is our outline of the full copper chain. So, when you first start the game, don't even worry about this. When you very first start the game, pre-science, you're just going to be worrying about a very, very simple production line that will look a little bit like so, with fuel in and ore in. That's about all you'll be capable of in the very early game before you get access to splitters. Once you get access to splitters and undergrounds, then you can do something more akin to the standardized Factorio furnace line briefly before you get up to the even more advanced with the advanced foundry. I will always suggest going for the advanced foundry as early as possible, specifically for iron, but copper also helps to go into the advanced foundry, particularly because you will have access to the hot air recipe at the same time, and as long as you can make a regenerative heat exchanger, which by this point you're in red science, so do bear that in mind. You'll have probably handcrafted enough red science to get access to this stuff. You're going to want to do this because it increases your output by about 50% most of the time. And it is, the numbers here are identical to the iron chain. So do bear that in mind. We've got 20 stone furnaces to process 15 units per second of ore into 1.875 per second of plates. You can do this with 10 advanced foundries to do the same output, and then you can use the same 10 to increase up to 2.812 with some hot air. From there, though, once you do get into proper red science, is when I say you should probably be thinking about this transition. As soon as you can make yourself the automated screeners and jaw crushers, which will require aluminium and Duralumin production, so bear that in mind as well. You will want to have some non-zero amounts of aluminium and duralumin, which is aluminium and copper, before moving on and starting actually setting up the real production chains for everything, copper, iron, etc. So starting off, first step is ore to grade 1 and grade 2. Bear in mind also that this does not take into account, this outline is simplified to exclude all outside inputs and all byproducts that aren't used within the chain. So this is the simplified version of the actual copper chain here. So we've got ore to grade 1 and grade 2. You can then process grade 1 into grade 2, and then all of your grade 2 combined into grade 3 and copper rejects. The copper rejects can also go into grade 3. Your combined grade 3 can be converted into grade 4, plus low-grade rejects. By the way, just as a point of reference, most of the time with most of the Impact Crusher recipes, you will see something akin to a reject into a higher grade. So if ever you have a screener step, which screeners also, by the way, will tend to have more than one output, just as a point of reference, they will tend to have more than one output that's used in the chain further down. So every time you have a reject, expect that some sort of impact crusher or secondary crusher will follow to process those things, just in general across all of the various chains. So copper rejects into grade 3, 3 into 4 plus low-grade rejects. Now, low-grade rejects in a classifier can be converted into more grade 4 as well as copper low dust. Now, I have indented this line here because you can wash your copper low dust to go into low-grade copper. Low-grade copper can only be casted in an advanced furnace, or foundry, I should say, can only be casted, and it cannot be converted into molten. So do bear in mind that you are forced to always cast plates out of low-grade copper. So at all times, you will always have the output of this once you get up to this step between grade 4 and low grade. So once you're here, this is your green science, by the way. At red science, you get access to grade 2. Do not do grade 2. I will point that out momentarily while we view the full chain. At green science, you'll get up to grade 4. Grade 4 can be converted into molten. So you can cast molten, plus you'll have plates coming off of your low-grade copper at green science. At blue science, you have the high-grade copper chain, I should say, to produce your high-grade copper. So from here, you will take your grade 4 that you were previously converting into molten, and then convert it into copper solution. The copper solution, however, is involved in 5 processes to come. So first off, you've got copper solution being converted into pulp 1 and copper pregnant solution. Your pulp 1 will then, with solution, be converted into pulp 2 plus copper pregnant solution. Copper solution plus pulp 2 goes into pulp 3, 3 into 4, and then 4 into only copper pregnant solution. So bear in mind, you're getting this copper pregnant solution in every step of processing copper solution. It's just split into several pieces for pulp 1 into pulp 2 into pulp 3 into pulp 4 into pregnant solution. So do bear that in mind. This is the most complex section, and it involves a lot of pipe work. But as you will see, it is not as bad as it may first appear. Then all of the pregnant solution that you have made thus far gets converted into high-grade copper in an agitator. And there's your blue science level of production. High grade goes into molten and can be casted into copper or duralumin. Then at utility science, the yellow science, you get access to reduction and to sintering at the same time. I would never suggest doing any molten out of reduced, always do it out of sintered. Sintered is the highest end level of things, and you will officially be inundated with all of the molten copper you could ever desire. So, plates, as I had mentioned, can be obtained through the ore, the grade 2, the low-grade copper, and the molten. Those are your only ways of getting plates, either through molten or through ore, G2, or low-grade. Molten is made in basic oxygen furnaces in this particular chain, and molten can be made from grade 4, high grade, reduced, and sintered. Those are your only options on molten here. So, after processing grade 4, your next step is high grade, which means doing this. Which means doing... Oops. Which means doing this whole chain. That's what it means. Doing this whole chain is the next thing before you can do molten again. And there's no stops in the middle where you can avoid some of the outside inputs. So let's actually have a look at what this chain looks like today. So starting off, we have our automated screeners processing planned out for 15 units per second in of the ore. This is a yellow belt of input being processed into G1 and G2. You then have your G1 going into G2. This produces stone as a byproduct, so you will have to figure out what you want to do with the stone. Voiding stone at this point in the early game will require that you have set up some titanium processing if you plan on burning it. Otherwise, you have the option of using a washer to convert the stone into saline water, and then you can void the saline water with a pit. With a pit! Where is my pit? Here, sinkholes. These guys. One sinkhole will be enough. You need steel in order to make sinkholes. From here, I will note that you can cast G2 copper. However, the difference between this process with hot air and 2.812 and this process with G2 is the difference between 2.812 and 3. One casting unit. You will get exactly, at this point in time, 4 in total between your automated screeners and your jaw crushers with the percentage outcomes, or actually there's no percentage outcomes even in this particular chain at this level of the chain. So you will have exactly 7.5 G2 out between these two steps, converting all of your ore into G2. You will have exactly 7.5 in the current state of the game, and this will give you 3 plates per second by casting. So consider that the difference between just taking ore plus hot air versus building, at the moment, 4 automated screeners and like 5 jaw crushers plus a casting unit to cast G2. While it does set you up to go further down the chain, it gives you your infrastructure that you're going to need anyway further down the chain. The actual efficiency bonus at Red Science to set up casting of copper is minuscule at this phase. It is a minuscule bonus. Literally a less than 0.2 plates per second difference to do this versus hot air. So do bear that in mind. That is a thing you might want to think about Do you do G2 casting of copper at Red Science? I would say maybe skip it for later and focus on other chains. Use your resources to make the buildings to start up some other chains in the meantime. And then once you do get to Green Science, definitely move on at this point to the G4 processing into Molten, because that is far, far more efficient than the previous processes. So speaking of getting up to the G4 processing, you will use your automated screener again, this time to give you G3 and rejects out of your G2. You will use the impact crusher to get rid of those rejects and convert them into more grade 3, as well as gravel, and you'll have to figure out what you want to do with the gravel. By this point, you should definitely be able to have burners, so you can just get rid of your gravel through burners, if you so desire. The grade 3 gets converted into grade 4, plus our beautiful low-grade rejects, and then the low-grade rejects will be converted into G4 plus copper low dust in classifiers, the classiest of machines. They shake all day. You will then take the copper low dust, and here is our split between the two pieces now. The copper low dust will go into low-grade copper, and the low-grade copper will go into plates with hot air. Only do hot air. There is an option to do this without hot air, but only do it with hot air. And this will just sit right here, and you'll get like a lot of plates out of this alone. Even with only one input of ore in, you're still going to end up with quite a lot of stuff here. Also, bear in mind the water in and tailings out. You will have to deal with the tailings. Either void it, use it to make Nexalit, use it to make crude oil, which is also totally a thing. Lots of uses for tailings, but most of the time when it's a byproduct like this, I would say 100% of the time, void it. Unless you really, really need the tailings and you don't want to set up something that's dedicated to tailings. So once you have this, you'll have this making plates, and then you'll have G4 that you have to do something with. So G4 can be made into molten. Bear in mind that for molten, you will need borax, oxygen, and fuel for the furnace, and then for casting, you need sand castings and borax. That is what you'll need here for this, to process your G4 into molten, and you will get enough molten out of this definitely to at least be able to feed a full copper belt, but also bear in mind, you'll have the output from this guy. It's not quite 6, by the way, it's not 2 per second in fully, but it is more than 15 total out if you're using 2 casting unit Mark 1s. So what are you going to do with the extra output? I would say, when combining the 2 sources of plates, input priority on this machine, because you're always going to want this machine moving to continue processing your copper low dust into low-grade copper, to keep things moving. You are always going to want this to move. So always, I would say, input priority this, allowing this to back up. And what does that ultimately mean? That means you will have an excess amount of molten. What will you use the molten for? If you haven't set up molten aluminium yet, nothing. But if you have set up molten aluminium, now is the time to switch over your Duralumin setup to do molten-based Duralumin. It will take in molten aluminium and molten copper in order to produce Duralumin for you, and it is a much, much, much more efficient recipe than converting straight up copper and aluminium plates into Duralumin. And that will be your solution to all of your Duralumin woes when making buildings or making early inserters before you start using the more efficient high petroleum handling inserter recipes out of belts. I highly suggest you, by the way, just as a side note, as soon as you get access to lubricant, do this transition on inserters, and as soon as you get access to the yellow belt out of rubber, at the same tech you get rubber, I believe, definitely do these transitions. Actually, this might be at engines, I forget. But oh, and there is an engine version as well, I think. Yes, an engine version here. So, what is it? The inserter one is important because it gets rid of the Duralumin requirement to make inserters. So that will help save on inserters once you get access to lubricant. And then you can use your Duralumin for other more important things, like helping to automate the production of various buildings that require Duralumin, like jaw crushers, for instance. They are rather important and require non-zero amounts of Duralumin. And then especially once you eventually start getting into the Mark II stuff, almost everything here is going to require Duralumin at Mark II. So definitely be ready for that extra stuff that you're going to need. So, once you get into chemical science, it's like speaking of getting into Mark II stuff, once you do get into your chemical science, your blue science, now is the time to think about doing the transition, taking all of your G4, bearing in mind you're always going to have this output of plates, unless for some reason you decide, let's just void the rejects here, the copper low dust step. This would be where you would do the voiding. If you really wanted, I would not suggest that. Here we have G4 into copper solution. You'll want to have a few machines for that. This will take in salt, not insignificant amounts of salt, so do bear that in mind. I mentioned in the iron overview tutorial that you can get basically infinite amounts of salt out of saline water if you're making saline water in a quenching tower recipe for either the iron copper or the borax niobium. And feeding the tar for that from renewably sourced tar out of destructive distillation columns converting coal into coke. If you get your coal out of mushrooms. So, mushrooms to coal to the tar, coal gas, and coke recipes from coal in DDCs. That will give you a bunch of tar to feed into the quenching tower. That gives you saline. It also gives you a lot of flue gas and a lot of tailings. It is a wonderful, magnificent recipe to make use of, well, pair of recipes to make use of your tar and convert, basically allows you to convert mushrooms into saline water. Or you can think of it this way: water for the mushrooms into salt. Water into salt in the end. Just abstracting away all of the steps in between, as well as, power required for that, and a rather large amount of space for your mushroom plantations in particular. So salt is, I consider, free because it can be made directly from water. You will notice that most things that I discuss here end up just being able to be made out of water. In fact, everything in Pyanodons mods, if you didn't know already, if you didn't watch the iron tutorial where I said this as well. Everything in Pyanodons mods can be sourced back to water, power, and space, except for one thing. One thing, which is the rare earth ores. Those are the only items that cannot be sourced outside of their own specific resource node. So do bear that in mind. And that is how I tend to approach Pyanodons these days is, okay, how can I make this out of water? And that's what I will be presenting to you here. So once you have your copper solution, bear in mind the copper solution is used for the following 5 steps of flotation. Every step of flotation is going to require this stuff. Acid solvent. Every single step is going to need acid solvent. And acid solvent is only used in the copper chain. So your only use of this stuff will be here. Now, this stuff requires iron oxide, sulfuric acid, and hydrogen peroxide. Well, I covered in the iron tutorial / overview the sulfuric acid. How to get sulfuric acid infinitely. Basically, you can make it out of acid gas made from coal bed gas without any real outside inputs outside of water. Because you can electrolyze water into oxygen for your coal gas, and you can perpetually make hot air here out of a bit of stone brick that gets converted into hot air from hot stone bricks, and these just go back and forth infinitely. Without a loss of materials, it's just power. So that sulfuric acid ends up being free in infinite amounts, just space and power. The iron oxides, you may, at this point in the game, well, at this point in the game, it's very likely that you have production of iron oxides, because in order to get to this point in the game, you will need circuit 2s and blue science, in which, in that process, you're going to need ferrite, which is made out of not insignificant amounts of iron oxide. So chances are you're already potentially converting iron plates into iron oxide with nitrobenzene. Again, all of the components of nitrobenzene can ultimately be sourced back down to water. So that is fine. You can get plenty of iron oxide through that, just spending a little bit of iron. However, iron oxide is also a very common byproduct of a number of different processes. You can also purposefully get iron oxide through alternative processes. You can technically get it from processing soil at this point in the game, in which that is a process that I am currently in the process of doing as of the recording of this video. I am currently in the process of doing this on my streaming save, where I am taking soil, converting it to sand, then taking sand and classifying it in a classifier, splitting it, at least I think it's in classifiers, it's splitting it into gravel as well as iron oxides, as well as crushed quartz, actually. And that is being used for gravel in particular to feed into stone wool production as part of getting a Zapir artificial reef setup going. That's going to be feeding lots of collagen for some beautiful drilling fluid 2 and 3, but that's highly advanced at this point. If you're not if you're not really thinking about that sort of level of scale yet, because that is a very huge setup to do, and it is a ton of machines, you're probably still gonna try to stick around to converting plates into iron oxide, rather than attempting to use only the iron oxides that you're getting as byproducts from other stuff. So that's the iron oxide. Last up is hydrogen peroxide. So hydrogen peroxide is made from nickel. Nickel, you're going to need nickel, as well as anthraquinone, or however the heck you pronounce that. So bear in mind, nickel, you'll have to bring in nickel. And then anthraquinone. Anthraquinone is chromium, as well as aromatics and liquid nitrogen. Aromatics can be gained very, very easily. Oh yes, here's my coal gas to acid gas to sulfuric acid. So there's your sulfuric acid. Aromatics are really easy. By this point, you will definitely have access to the mushroom and Relesia recipe into aromatics, so don't worry about any need for aromatics going forward. Just build up huge mushroom plantations as well as Relesias. Plenty of Relesias. Relesia, for reference, is soil plus hydrogen, whereas Falgi is water. And that's not taking into account recipes that involve fertilizer. I would actually say try to avoid fertilizer recipes for biotics at all costs, unless you are absolutely cramped for space. I say avoid them definitely at all costs. Now, that just leaves the liquid nitrogen. Chromium we'll talk about a bit later in another tutorial series, but just know that you can also ground bore chromium. Ground boring chromium is drilling fluid 2. Ground boring nickel is also drilling fluid 2 under normal circumstances. I, of course, am currently running a mod that I have made that makes ground boring, instead of using drilling fluid, use lubricant, which is what it required before Pyanodon changed it to needing drilling fluids relatively recently. Now, liquid nitrogen is going to require nitrogen, water, and gasoline, and the water makes steam, so it's a closed-loop water system. Gasoline! At this point in the game, you should already likely be making hydrogen peroxide. I want to throw this idea out here, like this notion, not even a notion, this undisputed fact. You will have hydrogen peroxide production set up in your factory by the time you're thinking about high-grade copper. And the reason for that is it is required as part of the Circuit 2 chain. Really, this is for those who haven't seen hydrogen peroxide yet, or who are just previewing what you'll need for high-grade. But yes, you will need to have set this up just to even get here in the first place. So bear in mind that, yeah, gasoline. Well, gasoline, by the way, has a recipe out of titanium tetrachloride and heavy oil. That is one option. My suggestion for gasoline, however, in fact, this is the process for gasoline that I personally set up when I was doing my Circuit 2 line on my personal playthrough on stream. I set up this guy doing water and hot air and heavy oil and titanium tetrachloride into gasoline for my liquid nitrogen. And then I was doing purest nitrogen in a DDC, which gives you a little bit of oxygen on the side, but it gives you nitrogen and purest nitrogen, which you have to filter to get into nitrogen. This was the whole reason why I set up, or at least one of the reasons why I set up filtration media in the first place. But anyway, there is a better solution. Once you're in blue science and you've started automating a lot of buildings at this point, so bear in mind that once you've really only think about doing this transition into more sustainable based bases that are built at much larger scale after you've done a transition and have started making a mall of all of the buildings that you'll need. Start automating some buildings. Like, only really think about this after that. So, gasoline has a recipe from Nexalit, olefins, light oil, and hydrogen. Nexalit, olefins, light oil, and hydrogen. What is the implication of this? Well, as I talked a bit about in the iron chain, I do believe, there is a recipe that is aromatics to olefins. There is a recipe, I forget exactly which building it is. If I have a look up here at iron, did I discuss this? I might not have yet. I am completely forgetting what I have and have not discussed yet. Anyway, point is that there is an olefins recipe from aromatics in an olefin plant. This is a rather important recipe because that means you can take mushrooms and flowers and convert them into aromatics and convert the aromatics into olefins. So there's your free olefins to feed this. Nexalit is made out of tailings, and tailings are absolutely free, so Nexalit is inherently free. Hydrogen is splitting water, so that's also inherently free. That just leaves you with light oil. Well, as it turns out, you can convert tar into light oil, and as I have already mentioned, you can make tar out of mushrooms from coal. So mushrooms to coal to tar. So you can use mushroom-based tar, and it will give you light oil, tall oil, and a little bit of even more aromatics. Now, you can take the tall oil and convert it also into light oil, and bear in mind, if you do watch this particular tutorial video and get to this point in the video and see this, I'm suspecting that this might change, because I think it might be off by a factor of 10, because it's literally 1 per second in on tall oil and light, and 2 on light to make 3 light. Yes, this converts tall to light, but you need a little bit of light to get it going, which you can use from here. So to process 70 tall oil, you'll need, 70 fluid separator Mark 1s. At this point, you should have access to Mark 2s. But bear in mind, that's a lot of buildings. And it gives you benzene as well. Hey, it's our good friend benzene that can get used in plenty of other things. It can get used in the process of making a xylanol back up here. Yes, xylanol has a recipe for your high grade iron or nickel. You can do it in either one, or even raw coal if you, for some reason, are doing raw coal processing. And that gives you all of your light oil and olefins and Nexalit to feed your gasoline. Just as a complete aside on all of this, to give you the gasoline for your liquid nitrogen. So there's everything you need ultimately for the acid solvent. Now, step 1 is not going to only need acid solvent, it is also going to need grease. And grease is made from lubricant, Nexalit, and lard. Lard, of course, comes from your muckmo pastures, which can be made sustainably through Relesia and Falgi. Similarly, with your lubricant, you can make lubricant out of aromatics from release the Anfaugi, and then Nexlet from tailings at any point. So grease is actually pretty free. It's not that bad, ultimately. It's a lot of fat, don't get me wrong, it's a lot of lard in the end, but it's not actually all that bad. If you have figured out that lubricant is sustainable through the aromatics recipe. Moving right along, we've got 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to pulp. There's no other outside inputs here besides acid solvent, and you're gonna end up with quite a bit of tailings. Quite a bit of tailings as well from this. And even when making your high-grade copper, you're still gonna end up with even more tailings. So that's it! Congratulations, you've made it to high grade. You can now make a lot more molten once you're at high grade. A lot more molten. Not like you'll really particularly need it, because chances are you might already have 2 lines of ore in, at minimum, and are producing a lot of copper out, and you might have way more copper than you really need, but we're just going to keep going, because next up, once you are at utility science, at your yellow science, you have access to the direct reduction and sintering processes. The direct reduction and sintering processes are identical across all of the various ore types that have it. These will require sodium sulfate in, diesel in, syngas in, and lime in. And if you want me to go over those, you can refer back to the iron processing chain, where I do give a general overview of how to obtain what processes I would use to obtain all of these. And this, of course, will give you a, I believe it is a 2 times efficiency bonus over high grade, over what you get out of the high grade in terms of molten. At least that is the case in iron. I am assuming that it is also the case here in copper, that it is probably about double in the overall output. It's double in terms of the high grade in versus centered out. Because high grade into reduced is a 1-to-1, and then it is a 1-to-2 to make centered. So you've now doubled your high grade into centered, and it ends up being, in the end, I think it's about double the amount of molten. So yeah, lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of molten copper. Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of copper plates, and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of Duralumin that you are capable of making at this point. Once you get up to high grade, it is your reward for getting up all the way to utility science. And with that, I think we have reached the end. So now that we are at the end of the copper chain here, I would like to, of course, thank you all for watching, and give a special shout out to everyone and all of the support thus far. The first video in this tutorial series has received significantly more views and such than the usual videos that I put up, so that has been quite motivating lately. Just one last thing here. Final thoughts on the copper chain overall. It's actually on the simpler side of things. In all actuality, it is not actually all that bad compared to some of the other things that you're going to need to deal with later on. There's no major, like, tricks here. There's not even any early percent-based outputs until you get into this step. And then after that, it's like, okay, the next thing is just it's like 2 reject steps processing have a percentage-based output. Otherwise, there's not really much else that has a percentage-based output early on. So it makes the math pretty simple. There's no feedbacks to create geometric series early on here. Overall, it's pretty just one thing into the next thing, into the next thing, into the next thing. And outside of just having the copper solution to feed all of the steps here, again, there's no major problems here outside of just make acid solvent and grease to feed this. It's acid solvent, grease, and salt. That's all you really need on high grade as the inputs. This is like I would call this the easiest thus far of what I have set up here on high grade overall as part of my preparation work. But we shall see if there's anything even more simple at the high grade step. Basically, the only process that's simpler than this in the early steps might be zinc, but we'll get to that when we get to that, and I make final conclusions after setting up the whole thing. And then once you do get to high grade, it's just the normal sintering setup in the end. And yeah, so overall, I'm very much happy with the copper chain. It is relatively simple. You'll need a lot of copper, but you are able to make enough copper easily. More easily than other ore processing chains. I would consider copper to be easier than iron, and actually less complex in terms of the outside inputs required for copper versus iron. So, again, with that, thank you all so very much for watching. Do not forget to comment, like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell if you're so inclined, if you have enjoyed this video. And head on over to twitch.tv/Otaku Showboat to leave a follow and turn on notifications to be reminded when I go live so that you can follow along on the personal playthrough where I am currently post Blue Science. I'm in that interregnum period between having finished all the Blue Science but haven't yet set up production science yet, so, or even thought about utility science. So we're sort of in this zone where we're not processing science, but we're building out and actually going through and am going to make all of the ore types that have high grade into high grade. Basically just catching up on all of the various different ore processes, as well as obtaining all of my ore out of ground boring. That is the major project that we are doing at the moment, because it's possible. It's unfeasibly huge, but I'm doing it anyway. So yeah, be sure to go and check that out. All of the VODs for that are also here on YouTube, and also don't forget to check out the companion blog post to this video that will be on my website, otakushowboat.com, and I hope to see you all on our next tutorial, where I will go over quartz and quartz processing into glass. I hope to see you all then.